If you spend enough time with the news, you start to realize after a while that all of the components of everything you might look at are connected. And I don't mean that in the woo sense of everything being connected. I mean it in the sense that if you spend enough time looking at the geopolitics backing war, for instance, at some point you'll realize you need to learn more about economics. This is the reason that in any given decade, there will be a collection of topics that seem almost impossible to avoid. At some point in human history, it would have been the Ottoman Empire or the British. Since World War II, it's mostly been the United States. It's increasingly, in this century, been things like climate change. It's been different components of the economy, depending on which sorts of animal spirits have been most popular and active in a given era. And sometimes it'll be things like an invasion of another country, or a global pandemic, which no matter what you report upon or start looking into or investigating or researching for whatever purpose, it seems like you can't avoid that subject. It's an uber subject that has tendrils that seep into everything else and thus is entangled with essentially anything else you might talk about. With some of my projects, I try to challenge myself sometimes with a sort of Bechdel test, but for the United States or for COVID or for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, to not talk about these subjects and try to report on something without touching on these larger elements. But it can be incredibly difficult to do that because these things are so all-encompassing and all of these things are so interconnected, even if not always overtly, superficially so. Now that said, I've got a trio of stories to talk with you about today. I'm Colin Wright. Let's talk about the news. The first story today is very much connected to one of those larger topics I just mentioned. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, which has long been connected with the Russian government, allowing them to do dirty deeds around the world and rent out their services in an effort to forward Russian ambitions around the world, but in a deniable arm's-length way. Prigozhin has died in a private plane crash. And this is notable in large part because, one, Wagner has been a very influential force not just in the invasion of Ukraine, so on Ukrainian territory, but also because Wagner is an important force across Africa in particular, with a lot of governments hiring out their services to fight their battles for them, especially with Islamist militant groups, extremist groups that do a whole lot of killing and kidnapping and generally who cause all sorts of havoc and who represent giant headaches for the governments in these areas, in some cases to the point that they destabilize those governments so far that there is a successful coup that then overthrows those governments. And I'll talk more about that in a second, actually, with another one of these stories, but more immediately, Prigozhin's plane going down is notable because of his influence then with global geopolitics, but also because he was an ally of Vladimir Putin's, Russian President Putin's. Putin brought him up, elevated him through the ranks, helping him achieve the level of power and prominence and wealth that he eventually reached. But then Prigozhin was also behind a pseudo-coup that Wagner forces launched against initially the Russian military, then seemingly the Russian government a couple of months ago. And it's pretty widely known that anybody who shows any insubordination or a lack of loyalty within Putin's Russia eventually finds themselves at the business end of poison or mysteriously falling out of very tall buildings. Being defenestrated is one of the dominant ways that wealthy, influential people within Russia tend to perish. And so folks in the know were mostly surprised when Prigozhin was allowed to live after launching this pseudo-coup that didn't quite make it to Moscow, but that really embarrassed Putin and his administration and caused a lot of shockwaves throughout the country. People were mostly surprised that he escaped unscathed. And that escape seemed to have been negotiated by the head of Belarus, who said, hey, send him over here. He can be exiled in this country. Out of your way, out of your hair. We might still benefit from Wagner's troops and the loyalty that they have to him as a consequence. So it seemed like something had been negotiated against all odds. But now this plane crash, which killed Prigozhin and something like 10 of his closest allies, in addition to the pilot and such, is being seen as Prigozhin's falling out of a very tall building, being poisoned. It's almost gobsmackingly obvious that he was offed by some portion of the Russian establishment, of the Russian state. They would never say this, obviously, but they've definitely nodded to it in ways that they typically do. That allows them to both have denial and say, we are not doing executions, assassinations of this kind, but also, you know we are, so you better be loyal. This death hasn't been thoroughly investigated yet. There's still a chance that maybe Prigozhin's name was on the manifest but wasn't on the plane. Everybody is kind of assuming that he's dead, and everybody's kind of assuming that Putin or somebody working for him did it. On the topic of coup d'etats in Africa against governments in the region, just a few weeks ago, the Nigerian government suffered a successful military coup, the first successfully democratically elected government in the country's history, was overthrown by the military, and other nations in the region are not happy about it. The democratically elected governments of these other nations in particular, and they're part of a mostly trading but also political and somewhat military body called ECOWAS, which stands for the Economic Community of West African States. This group is aiming for economic self-sufficiency as a collective unit. They're trying to work together to help this portion of the continent, which has been historically plagued by all sorts of badness, some of it external with colonization and slavery, some of it internal with the radical extremist groups and all sorts of violence that has occurred by the governments against the people and by external groups just trying to target those governments, trying to target those people for a variety of different reasons. But they've also suffered a slew of coup d'etats from their militaries over just the past 3 years or so. And in fact, they actually had to boot Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso in recent years because their governments were overthrown by successful military coups, and this group is trying to maintain democracy in the region, in part in order to ensure they're able to continue trading with a lot of their Western, primarily, trading partners internationally, so that they can attract more investment, but also not have military dictators, individuals or juntas, collections of military dictators acting as a committee, running things. So this group, ECOWAS, is saying it is not okay that you overthrew the Nigerian government, military people now in command of the Nigerian government. You need to leave and put those democratically elected politicians back in office. And the new heads of Niger, those military leaders, are saying, no, we are definitely not going to do that. And ECOWAS is saying, well, maybe we'll have to invade then, or do other things, sanctions, things like that. And those governments that were cast out of ECOWAS recently because they overthrew their own governments, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Mali, are saying, well, if you invade Niger, we will consider that to be attacks on us. And so in this part of the continent, which is often referred to as the coup belt or the coup corridor, because there's been so many military coups straight across this portion of the continent, there's a group of democratically elected governments that are trying to stop that trend, in part because they simply don't want to see more military governments, in part because military coups tend to be contagious, because they show other militaries in the region what they might get away with. But they are also, again, trying to enrich the region by working together, and part of that working together structure is maintaining democracy. So that's on one side. On the other side, there's this loose collection of military dictatorships that are also being externally supported by different groups like Russia. And so the concern here is that there might be a standoff of some kind that could then turn into a proxy conflict with the democracies in the region supported by the West, including traditional leadership like France, which famously colonized this area, causing a lot of those issues a long time ago, so they're not super popular there right now, but they do maintain troops in the area, so does the United States, to help fight some of those extremist religious groups. And then on the other side, you have a who's who of authoritarian governments. Russia, potentially China, potentially Iran. They might come in to support some of their ideological fellow travelers in this instance, which then would lead to a whole lot of trouble for the folks who are unfortunate enough to be living in an area that sees an influx of all of these troops, all of these weapons, all of this new training, and it could then become a generational thing rather than a short-lived blip on the area's radar. something that then long-term would make it much more difficult for them to become enriched, for people's quality of life to improve, and instead it would become a cesspool of constant warfare. And then third today, and this is something that I got a bit deeper into with this week's Let's Know Things podcast episode, which you can find wherever you get your pods or at letsknowthings.com, the BRICS group of nations, which traditionally has been Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a group of nations that has a huge chunk of the global population, something like 40% of the global population, and when it was formed in 2010, the BRICS version, as opposed to a precursor group, BRIC, without South Africa, the BRICS group, when it formed in 2010, had something like 15% of the global GDP, tucked away within its member nations. They are, for the first time since they accepted South Africa 13 years ago into the fold, accepting 6 new nations, more than doubling in size. And those 6 new countries being inaugurated into this bloc beginning on January 1st of 2024 are the United Arab Emirates, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Very different countries from the ones that are already part of this group, but all potentially burgeoning economies that have not hit their peak yet. They are not dominant global players, but they're a step down from that in most cases, with Ethiopia a little bit lower than that probably in terms of its economic reach and its regional influence. But each of these nations brings something new to the table. In some cases, some kind of regional sphere of influence. In other cases, the potential to be something really big and significant by around 2050, which is the case with Ethiopia. And then in other cases, a whole lot of wealth today, which is the case with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is interesting in part because some members of the existing BRICS group, like China and Russia, really want to push the group toward building a second global power structure for the planet, as the current global power structure is largely controlled by what you might loosely define as the West, with the United States at the center of that, in large part because of the dominance of the USD in global trade. Even nations that are trading with each other and not trading with the United States at all typically pay their debts and pay for fuel and food and things like that using US dollars. And that's part of what gives the United States the ability to apply sanctions on so many countries, because it can in part just kick people out of the global financial network that allows these trades to happen the way that they do. China and Russia would like to get away from that for perhaps obvious reasons. They would like to use the yuan or the ruble, or if they're really desperate, the rupee from India. But India and also Brazil are not super keen on building an alternative to what's being used today. They'd simply like to build a parallel track. They'd like to make the globe a bipolar sort of state rather than having just one pole. They want to have different control structures, different points of leverage, something that will allow them to deal on even terms with the folks who currently have outsized influence and a whole lot of leverage that biases all of these international structures toward them. And so there's a conflict within this group to a certain degree between the folks who want to pivot away from what's happening now and the folks who just want to take a bigger slice of the existing pie. And consequently, there was a big controversy over whom to allow in, which nations to bring into this group. And they had a lot of nations to pull from. They had dozens of governments that wanted to join this BRICS bloc. They only allowed in 6 this time, but they have made clear that they will continue to accept more in the future. And it would seem that these different groups, with these different opposing ideas of what they want this bloc to become, each got a little something for their side. Some new groups, like Iran, that definitely want to deviate away from the USD as they have been crushed by economic sanctions from the United States for years and years. But then other groups like Argentina, that, like their neighbor and close ally Brazil, would probably be perfectly happy just to take a bigger slice of what's already there and to continue dealing with everybody on the planet, not just the United States, not just China, but anybody who wants to trade with them. Most assessments from analysts in the know consider them to have not lived up to their potential so far, in part because there's so many different entities and different forces at play from within this still relatively small but influential organization. So they have a lot of leverage, and now they have even more leverage beginning on January 1st of next year. but that leverage is being aimed in so many different directions that the potential force they might wield is becoming quite diffuse and therefore not as potent as it might otherwise be if everybody was aiming in the same direction. So those are some stories that I've been watching this week, all three of them connected to those larger forces that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, all of them entangled with other stories. If you pay attention to the news in the coming weeks, you'll probably see a whole lot of minor stories connected to these big uber stories, these central core trunk stories. If there are any topics that you'd like me to cover, any questions that you have about what's happening in the world today, please leave a comment and let me know about that. I'd be happy to explain something that's happening that doesn't make sense, or connections between various things if you're confused about something like that. Please let me know. Also, and this is something that I'm just perennially curious about, let me know what your relationship with the news is. Is it something you find interesting, entertaining, fulfilling, panic-inducing? Take a quick moment to let me know what that relationship is like for you, as that informs the types of content that I will continue to produce for this channel.